Emergency Preparedness Coordinator for the Moraga-Orinda Fire District. And tonight we're going to talk about getting prepared for fire season. And first off, I want to launch a quick little poll. It should appear on your screens. If you wouldn't mind checking in on that while we're waiting for a few more folks to sign in. It just basically asks which city do you live in? So we'll get a count of that, and I'll pass on the information there. All right, those results are coming in. It looks like 46 of the 54 participants have responded to that. We've got 34 Orinda residents, 4 from Moraga, 2 from Canyon, 2 from Lafayette, and 4 from other. So I'm going to close that poll now. Thank you very much for participating, and we appreciate everybody that's been able to join us tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn the discussion over to our fire chief, David Winokur, for the presentation tonight. Fire Marshal Jeff Isaacs and myself will be monitoring the chat. So if you have a question that you want to ask, please feel free to put it in the chat to everyone, and we'll try and answer those. And then at the end of the presentation by Chief Winokur, we'll open it up to live questions and answers. So thank you very much again. And with that, Chief Winokur.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm just going to do a little slide moving here to be able to share some slides with you. Really, a couple of things we'd like to do tonight. One, share some tips and thoughts about things that the folks can do to prepare for fire season, and share some of the information related to things the fire district is doing. All of this comes together to say we believe this is a all of the above. It's going to take work from residents, it's going to take work from the fire district and first responders. It's all going to come together for us to move the needle and reduce our community's exposure to wildfire risk. As Dennis mentioned, there are an opportunity to ask questions, which will be answered in the chat. Please feel free to put those in as they come up. And as a general summary, what we'll talk about tonight is we'll talk about fire history, the current fire, the risk we have of fire due to this season's abnormally low precipitation levels, a little bit of how fire spreads and how that relates to the things we are doing, a discussion about some of the community-wide projects and programs the fire district is progressing with, and then the specific requirements of what residents can do on each of their parcels. And the thing I would ask everyone to think about as we get started is that the work you do on your individual parcel, on your property, that has a direct impact on protecting your home and reducing your home's exposure to wildfire risk. But it also has a direct impact on the ability to fire to progress across your property onto the property of your neighbor. And taken cumulatively, a landscape made up of all of these parcels, when all of them have been mitigated and are in compliance with the fire code and do not have dead, dry vegetation and combustive fuel beds, when that work has been done, our community as a whole is made more safe. And not only from a fire perspective, but as it relates to evacuation, our ability to rapidly move people out of the community. And more importantly, as it relates on an annual basis, as it relates to insurance and your ability to get homeowners insurance, to not receive a non-renewal or cancellation or experience significant rate hikes, which has become quite an issue throughout the state. So with that, I'll attempt to share screen. All right. Okay, so let's start talking about fire season preparation. For those of you who have seen me talk before, I always like to point out that the Bay Area has a rich fire history. And on the right, we see a blown up view of the entire East Bay with different blobs showing where fires have burned in different areas. And on the left, we see a close-up of our area. And the green line running from top right to bottom left, that's Highway 24. And the Moraga-Orinda, our area, is slightly here to the right of these big outlines. That was not what I wanted. of these big outlines that show wildfires in 1923. The Berkeley Hills Fire burned out of Wildcat Canyon into the city of Berkeley and was the most destructive fire in California history at its time. The 1970 fish fire that burned around the Oakland Hills and destroyed a number of homes. And as many of you may have lived through the 1991 tunnel fire, which burned out of the Oakland Hills, down through the Berkeley Hills and across Highway 24. What characterized all of those fires when they occurred into the fall months, when we see very low fuel moisture levels, very low humidity, and very high wind speeds coming out of the north and northeast. That is the conditions under which we are at the risk of catastrophic wildfire. And all of our planning and our preparation really centers on how we can reduce our community's risk on those days. Another thing from today, from taking a look at what the fuel moistures look like in the area. Blue is where we are right now. The gray line that you see well above blue is where we ought to be on average this time of year. The current for this reading in the Santa Cruz Mountains in this area was at 14.5. The current in our district today was at 7%. And when fuels have low fuel moisture level, they are more likely to burn. They are more able to burn. And it's worth noting that we are right now on this track, we're seeing levels we shouldn't be seeing until June and July. And that's really concerning because as fuels dry out sooner, we effectively lengthen the fire season and we're exposed to more days. There are more opportunities where things can burn if there's an ignition source. So that's a graph with a bunch of lines on it that summarize what we already know, that it has not rained with any decent amount this year. And the lack of that rain is causing potentially an early onset of the fire season. And as we look at the grass covered slopes around us, note on the south facing slopes, we're already seeing fuels start to cure, turning from green to brown. Once they've turned brown, they become available to burn and they will not turn green again this year. That is very troublesome and something to take into consideration as you're planning out your annual approach to wildfire preparedness. So the next thing, just a brief primer on fire science. First, fire is a normal and recurring element in this environment. Pre-European settlement, the Mediterranean counties of California burned every 3 to 5 years. Clearly, we have disrupted that over the last 100 and some odd years, but let's be clear that fire is not the new normal. Fire is the old normal. And it was an aberration that we excluded fire for as long as we did, which allowed significant accumulation of vegetation that otherwise would have burned off. That bill is now coming due, as we have seen over the last 4 or 5 years with catastrophic fire year after year. Next is that when a fire begins, it spreads via 2 components. The first is the flame front. That's this traditional fire we would think of moving from vegetative item to vegetative item across the landscape, very linear advance. The second one, which is very concerning for our case, is 3-dimensional ember cast. This is sparks, embers, firebrands carried by high winds, potentially miles in advance of the main body of fire. And every time those embers, firebrands, and sparks land on something else that will burn, a field of dead grass, accumulation of dry leaves, something like that, they start fires in their own right. And the prevalence of receptive fuel beds, as we refer to them, is indicative of a community's exposure to a wildfire threat during a high wind event. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our concern really centers around the fall months with high wind-driven conditions, where a fire burning miles away could rapidly spread into our community, regardless of how many external fuel breaks or roads or other things are around our community. In October of 2019, a fire burning in the Vallejo, Benicia area on the north side of the Carquinez Strait sent aloft an ember that carried all the way across the Carquinez Strait over the city of Crockett and started another fire along the Cummings Skyway that went to several hundred acres. Just something to think about, that the idea that the external fuel breaks that the fire district continues to work on, they have value, but only against one of the 2 ways in which fire spreads. And the next one to consider is the elements that go into fire spread. One is the topography, the shape of the land, the way it channels, the wind, those things. We cannot affect topography. The next is the weather. We have no control over the weather, and quite frankly, it's getting worse. The third component, however, is fuel. And this is the one that we have the ability to impact. We can modify fuels. Fire cannot burn through air. It cannot burn through open space. It has to have a fuel substrate that will carry it. And when we modify fuels and we break fuels up in a manner that they make the fire work hard to find a path, we disrupt the ladder through which it can climb vertically and horizontally. We slow fire. That buys time for an evacuation and for an effective firefighting response. So as we think about this, understanding that of the three components that go into fire spread, there's only one that we can control. And that one that we can control is most valuable when that work is done in close proximity to our homes and to the other values at risk that we seek to protect. It really forms a call to action for residents and homeowners to do the work to create defensible space and reduce the prevalence of combustive vegetation in the home ignition zone, that is the areas closest to your home. In doing that, you protect your home, you protect your neighbors, and you protect our community. So these are 7 lines of effort. I will not go through them respecting everyone's time in great detail. I'll just say that there's a document that outlines our wildfire prevention strategic plan. It identifies these 7 lines of effort, which have been guiding our work over the last 4 years. And each one was intending to be mutually supportive. Work we do on external fuel mitigation projects or fuel breaks creates a synergistic effect when combined with internal fuel mitigation projects and small parcel fuel mitigation. Wildfire pre-planning allows us to rapidly flow firefighters from both our agency and surrounding agencies to the site of a fire when they occur. Our evacuation planning means there is a coordinated and timely movement of residents out that is deconflicted with the flow of firefighting resources in. Our progressive building code updates, which were last updated in 2020 and will be up for review later this summer with adoption in January of 23, create a built environment that is less susceptible to fire. And our community outreach and education efforts are designed to encourage people to carry out their part with regard to internal fuel mitigation projects on your parcels and evacuation pre-planning. And lastly, we've done quite a bit of work in the early detection and notification space so that we are more likely to know if there is a fire has been started, to buy time that we can use to aggregate the effective firefighting force and execute an orderly and efficient evacuation. So with regard to fuel breaks, in 2019, MOFD received a $4.25 million state grant as part of the governor's 35 priority projects. It was selected as one of those. This created a fuel break running about 19.3 miles from Acalanes High School, running along the northern end of Lafayette and Orinda, all the way up to Inspiration Point and out Nimitz Way in Tilden in unincorporated Contra Costa County. In 2021 and 2022, we received an additional $250,000 in state funding and created a fuel break along the Pinehurst right-of-way, leading out of Moraga towards the community of Canyon and Oakland. And most recently, late last year, we were awarded a $6.3 million fuel break to create the Tunnel East Bay Hills project, which you see outlined below. Between these 3 projects, we will essentially created a moat around the district, which will be effective under the right conditions, with slower stopping the ground component of a wildfire spread. It's important to note, however, that as important as we think these projects are and as much effort has gone into them, they will not be effective against blown embers. And it's very important that these be carried out in conjunction with defensible space and home hardening work within the populated areas of the district. Here's a snapshot of our fuels mitigation dashboards available on our website. This is last year's project. We had a goal of making it to 1,000 piles of fuel created by various landowners. We were able to mitigate 1,320, removing an estimated 596 tons. We completed 11 prescribed burns for a total of 78.7 acres. We continue with both the chipping and burning, both pile burning and broadcast burning, in partnership with both residents and some of the landowning agencies that surround the district. With regard to education, a little bit more on it in a moment, but we've expanded our Fire Adapted Community Ambassadors program, which has been training residents to share fuel mitigation and fire preparedness information with their neighbors as an effective way to increase our reach. Our website, specifically under Hazardous Wildfire Fuels Reduction Program, which you see is shown there on the right, includes a number of videos and other useful information that can help residents better understand what the requirements of a mitigated parcel look like. We certainly encourage folks to be prepared to evacuate, continue to work with our partners at PD and CERT referencing the state's Ready, Set, Go program that encourages residents to be prepared for an immediate evacuation when ordered. And then lastly, we do continue to sponsor and organize the La Morinda CERT for those who are interested in receiving more specific training over a longer period with greater detail. We certainly encourage you to consider signing up for the CERT training course. Our Adapted Communities Ambassadors, we trained a number of volunteers in April of 2021. In May of 2021, they began doing assessments. They completed over 400 throughout various areas of the community. It was run as a pilot program, which is now being expanded and is intended to increase outreach and education. We're in the process of recruiting an additional cohort of volunteers for this training, and I encourage folks to keep an eye out for that. On the right here, you see the information they were handing out. Everything about this is correct with the exception of the date, which ought to be changed for this year, and has an English version on the front, a Spanish version on the back, a QR code on the top right that's available. This is available on our website. We found this has been very useful for sharing with folks who have gardeners and landscapers. It's been a great way to focus those people on the specific things that can be done to reduce wildfire. Starting now, a little bit every visit, we'll get your parcel looking much better by the time true fire season rolls around. For residents who have done the work that we'll talk about here in a moment and gone through all the specifics of what you believe it took to become compliant with the fire code as explained, we encourage you to follow our self-report and self-compliance of hazard abatement via our website. You can get to it through the How Do I link on the top right, or from the drop down under fuel mitigation, fire prevention on the left. But what's so important about this is that we have a finite number of resources and a finite number of hours in the day. In the case of fire prevention, we have 4 full-time staff that conduct inspections and run our chipping program and do some other things. Every time those staff members go to a property that is already compliant, that has already done the work, that is a missed opportunity where they could have been out opening people's eyes to what is required and someone who doesn't know, who hasn't engaged in this space yet. So if you are one of the people who is aware of the issue, you're aware of how to become compliant, and you have done the work, when you self-report, we can take you off the list, as it were. And that's one less allocation of staff time that has to go out and check a parcel that's already compliant. So we'd really encourage folks to do that. As you get your parcel compliant, take the pictures, send them in, encourage your friends and neighbors to do the same. It's tremendously helpful for us to be able to take properties off the list, to be able to focus our resources on those properties that either don't know or are not willing to do the work on a voluntary basis. Which gets us to the discussion of enforcement. So we have a full-time staff of 4 folks that from starting June 1st will be out doing enforcement work. We prioritize those resources along our major evacuation routes because that's the area where the most people are going to have the most exposure to fire risk in the event of an evacuation. If the evacuation routes, which are very limited, are opened up and are functioning and are not encroached with either brush or flame emanating from that brush and other ground fuels that could support major fire spread, if those have been proofed or prepared or hardened in advance, that'll be a significant contributor to our ability to move people out of harm's way. The second priority is the perimeter of the community. We're very worried about a fire, specifically a vegetation fire on a northeast wind day coming out of the Briones watershed into the populated parts of the district. We've been doing quite a bit of work to ensure that properties along the perimeter of the community are compliant with the fire code, have created good defensible space as a way to slow or stop a fire spread out of the wilderness lands into the developed areas. Once those 2 priority areas have been addressed, then we move on to large undeveloped parcels, responding to inside the district, the populated areas of the district, responding to resident complaints and other areas that are indicated as priorities by the maps included in our CWPP. When we come out and we identify that someone has been non-compliant with the fire code, there are no fines during the initial assessment. There are numerous opportunities for a resident to voluntarily do the work and get into compliance. As we move farther into the process and a person is established they're either unwilling or unable to do the work, we can then move forward with either citations that include fines or lien funded work that includes that has a district funded contractor carry out the required mitigation work, and then a tax bill is used to settle the lien. There are more details on that on the next slide. If you take a look at the 2017 through 2020 data included under slides or bullets 4 through 7, you'll see we have significantly ramped up our activity in this space over the last 4 years. 2017, we conducted about 90 inspections. That ramped up to last year. In 2020, we conducted over 3,000 inspections with similar numbers last year. This is our Fire Prevention Division's year-end report that was published to the MOFD board recently. And there you see our activity to include 147 dead tree complaints, 716 property transfer inspections, just about 2,000 assessments in addition to the property transfer inspections, and a number of others. And the item I'd like to point out to you here is 2 things. One, we received 147 complaints of dead trees. A couple of those moved forward to liens. Dead trees are particularly challenging from my perspective to understand, that is, because a dead tree is clearly a dead tree, and a dead tree is not going to come back. When a pine tree has turned orange or red, it is dead. And we are regularly out knocking on people's doors to point out a dead tree that either their neighbor has brought to our attention or that we spotted just because it was visible from the public right of way. And frequently that knock on the door then begins an ongoing process that takes repeat visits to compel the homeowner to do some work. And it's just one of those things that causes us to struggle to understand what are folks waiting for. So I would ask everyone to please take a hard look at your property, look for those dead trees, look for the items we're going to talk about here in a moment. And if there's work to be done, please do it. It'll protect your home, it'll protect your neighbors, it'll protect our community. And to that point, we had 21 properties that made it all the way through a number of steps to where they were ordered to abate, and 7 of those were abated at by a district contractor, and then tax liens filed. So in 7 cases here, we had folks who just would not do the work, and it really slows down our process. Or I'm sorry, it was 7 in 2020, 3 in 2021. 2 of those were settled, or 3 were settled last month to bring to 6. For the total. So it just slows down the process when we have to go back through this process to do the work in an external manner. We ask folks to be proactive about maintaining their property. So now we get to the requirements for what needs to be done on each parcel. In 2020, the new fire code was adopted, and the following things went into effect. First, the annual compliance date became 31 May. Previously, it was in the middle of June. We believe moving it to 31 May was important, especially in a year like this one, where we've seen a reduction in late season rains, and we've seen an increase in fire activity before our deadline. So for folks who have annual grass and weeds that are growing, that grass needs to be cut to less than 3 inches, no later than 31 May. Next one was a big one. This has to do with zone 0, if you will, the home ignition zone. And this was a ban on the use of combustible ground cover within 2 feet of a structure. This includes mulch. Mulch will generate approximately 6-inch flame lengths and will absolutely carry fire up to a house and find the void spaces and burn it to the ground. So in the district, it is a violation of the fire code to use combustible ground cover to include mulch within 2 feet of a structure. We have a long way to go there. I will be the first to admit that compliance has not been good. I would ask folks to please take a look at your home, and if you have mulch there, rake it back at least 2 feet. If you live in an HOA, please talk to your landscaping committee about the requirement and encourage them to begin incorporating that, and recommend that it be done no later than the end of May. The next one, which is associated with the removal of combustive ground cover, is the requirement that any vegetation planted within 2 feet of a structure, and I'll have some pictures around this in a second because it's a little confusing. But if you have any vegetation planted within 2 feet of a structure, that is within the 2 feet where you're required to remove the combustive ground cover, that vegetation, those privets, the decorative plantings, the boxwoods, et cetera, they need to be trimmed up to create at least a 1 foot vertical air gap between the ground and the lower portion of the vegetation. And there'll be more on that in a second. Bear with me, please. But think 2 feet out, 1 foot up, making a small box next to the house on the ground. There needs to be nothing that'll burn there. And that becomes critically important in protecting homes from embers, that if embers begin a small fire in that space, it will absolutely burn your house down, regardless of the number of suppression resources that are available. And creating those passive measures, that interruption of the fuel substrate that will carry fire, where it matters most, right next to the home, is critically important and something only homeowners can do. It's at very low cost. It does not involve very much vegetation or particularly large areas, and it's mostly an aesthetic thing. And we would ask for everyone's support in bringing your property into compliance with that specific element. The next one is a requirement that the tree canopy has to be at least 6 feet measured vertically from the ground or from a roof. So for trees near the ground, a normal sized person should be able to walk the drip line of the tree and not hit their head on anything. If there are trees overhanging your roof, they're required to have 6 foot vertical clearance from the roof to the lower portion of the tree. You're also required to remove any eucalyptus or Monterey pine that are planted within 6 feet of a structure. That's very rare. We've had a few cases of those, but due to the combustibility of those trees and their propensity to drop things that accumulate in valleys and gutters, that was incorporated into the fire code. When a home is sold in the fire district, it's required to do so with an exterior fire hazard inspection. We've had very good compliance from the real estate industry in support of this, and we thank the realtors for their support. We think this is a critical way to harness some of that equity as leaving the district on a sale and ensure that homes aren't being sold that have fire code violations on them. And then by the end of 2023, so we still have some time yet, but it'd be a good idea to start thinking about this sooner rather than later. By the end of 2023, we'll require the removal of juniper and bamboo within 10 feet of a road. And this is because juniper and bamboo under red flag diablo wind conditions put off approximately 10.1 foot flame lines. And if those items of vegetation are within 10 feet of the road, it's very likely that those flames will impinge upon the road and close it in some cases, shutting off evacuation routes. So while we would love to see all juniper and bamboo removed, the fire code is written specifically to remove the juniper and bamboo that will threaten people upstream, your friends and neighbors who live uphill from you. It threatens their ability to get out. We think that's a reasonable public safety move. And if you were taking that vegetation out, it would not be a bad idea to continue. Juniper is particularly fire prone and very problematic. These are some elements that are unchanged and continue to be a requirement in the district. First, any annual grass and weeds need to be cut to less than 3 inches by 31 May. Irrigated grass is in a little bit different category, but things that are not irrigated, that have an annual growing cycle and then die or cure, need to be cut to less than 3 inches. Ground litter, things that have fallen from trees and accumulated on the ground that will burn, those need to be removed. Concentrations of non-irrigated wild brush, specifically coyote brush in our area, those need to be either removed in their entirety or thinned to the point that there is horizontal separation between them that would prevent fire spreading from item to item. Roofs and gutters need to be maintained free of combustive material. This is something that does require revisiting in the fall as trees begin to turn and to drop leaves again, right as we move into high fire season. It's very important that your gutter and roof is clear of deposited leaves and needles and such. If an ember lands on a gutter or a valley of a roof that is completely filled with pine needles and dead leaves, that house will absolutely burn regardless of the type of roofing material used. And then any ladder fuels. So this is where, as you mentioned previously about the requirement for a 6 foot air gap from a tree, if you have vegetation growing under a tree that forms a ladder that provides a pathway that ground fire can move its way up into the canopy of the tree, those ladder fuels must be removed to create the air gap. You want to see at least 6 feet between the lower portion of a tree and the ground, or any fuels growing on the ground underneath the tree, to include brush and bushes and privets and other things that can climb up into the tree canopy. And lastly, as you're doing this work, for those of you who are City of Orinda residents, the city's Measure R funded chipper is available to come chip material with scheduling. MOFD's chipper is available with some information provided on our website. And since you're all Republic Waste Services customer, you currently have a 64-gallon green bin. If you call them at the number provided there, they will happily provide you a 96-gallon green bin at no additional charge, and up to 4 green waste pickups of additional material that's in bags and tied off appropriately by calling that number there to schedule. So it's something to think about, that you're already paying for this service. If you're producing more material than your green bin can handle, you can get a larger green bin for free, and you can call for up to 4 green bin or green waste pickups per year at no additional charge. So to get into some examples of what right looks like, here's an example where the owner, the resident, has pulled back their mulch at least 2 feet. They've replaced it with river rock, and they've trimmed up the decorative planting there, the privet, to create at least a 1 foot vertical separation between the ground or ground fuel and the lower portion of that the canopy there. And if you look in the middle there, you see there's a vent, and that's a relatively large mesh vent. So picture if 6-inch flame lengths were being carried through this mulch. When it got to the vent, those flames would be pulled into the void space of the house. Behind that T111 siding, there is most likely tar paper. Fire would find that. Now fire would start to work its way up the walls and through the crawl spaces of the house. And as it did that, as this house started to burn, it would put off a tremendous amount of heat and convective energy, which would then potentially impact either vegetation or other homes around them. This is why it's so important that we create that separation in the fuel substrate so that fire does not have a pathway to find those void spaces and gaps into our homes. Here we see another case of instead of river rock or bare mineral soil, this resident is using creeping green ground cover. That's allowed within 2 feet of structure. It's non-combustive, and they've trimmed up those bushes there so that there's at least 1 foot vertical air gap, with the exception of that 1 or 2 branches on the right that could use a little extra work. But you can see how there's just nothing that will carry fire across the yard up to the house with the use of that creeping green ground cover. Here we see another case of creeping green ground cover being used in lieu of mulch. And here's the reason we want to do this. On the left, we see a home that's surrounded by Sierra chips, by fresh mulch. On the right, we see a home that's surrounded by aggregate. After 10 minutes of having wind-driven embers thrown at this house, the left side of the structure is fully involved. The right side is unaffected. We would like to move the community to looking more like the right side in this example. And just for review, we'll quickly remind everybody, work needs to be done by the end of May. Combustible ground cover to include mulch is banned within 2 feet of a structure. Within that 2 feet, you need to create at least a 1 foot air gap between the ground and any vegetation growing within 2 feet of a structure. Tree canopies need to be at least 6 feet from the ground or a roof. Eucalyptus or Monterey pine within 6 feet of a structure must be removed. Any juniper or bamboo within 10 feet of a road must come out by the end of 2023. Annual grass and weeds needs to be cut to less than 3 inches by 31 May. Any ground litter that's accumulated underneath trees needs to be removed. Non-irrigated brush needs to be removed or thinned. Roofs and gutters need to be maintained free of combustive material. Roadside clearance is required 3 feet back, 15 feet up. Dead or dying trees must be removed. And ladder fuels, which would allow a fire to climb from the ground into the tree canopy, must also be removed. I will leave that up as a reminder. Dennis or Jeff, do we have any questions in the chat that we haven't been able to answer yet?
I think we've been pretty good at keeping up with questions in the chat. If anybody has any other questions, you can use the raised hand feature and we can move on to that.
So Susan, you have a question for dead trees. So a specific to sudden death oak, you should not use, those should not be chipped and they should not be used. It spreads the spores to contribute to sudden death oak. For a Monterey pine that has died off because of old age, I certainly would defer to an arborist with regard to whether or not there's something there that would prevent that they shouldn't be spread, but typically those are beetle kill. And I'm not aware of any issues with using those as mulch as long as it's not within 2 feet of the structure. And then Mary Beth, a question about these requirements for Moraga area or all of California. So the California Fire Code provides minimums, some of which are included here. However, the Fire Code is adopted and amended by MOFD. So there are local amendments, which many of these are, that only apply in Moraga and Orinda, the statewide standard. Ours meets or exceeds the statewide standard. So statewide, you very likely see there's some derivatives of these. However, there are not, there's nothing about these in the full list that makes them apply statewide. With regard to creeping green ground cover, there's a question about do we maintain a list? We do not. If it is green and it does not have a decadent component, it doesn't have a lot of dead things like say like a rosemary bush that maintains a large decadent component, and it is on the ground, that it is permissible. We don't. We're just not well positioned to get in and try to determine if one species is or is not. So to review, anything that is green, irrigated, on the ground, does not have a decadent component, that would be acceptable as a mulch replacement in lieu of the in lieu of mulch. With regard to dead trees on Highway 24, it was about a 3-year process, but Caltrans is committed to removing those dead trees. They have funding, and their challenge of late has been finding contractors to do the work. They're moving forward in fits and starts. They've made good progress. We look forward to seeing more of those trees come out in the near future. However, I don't have any timeline or updates for those. Dennis, can you please clarify number 5 feet? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Roadside clearance. So vegetation that is within 3 feet measured horizontally of the road surface or 15 feet measured vertically needs to come out. This really has to do with maintaining the trafficability of the road. But if you have a tree that's hanging over the road within 15 feet, that portion of the tree needs to be removed. Usually those are pretty easy to spot because they are scarred and dinged by trucks and other things that have hit them. But you're required to have 3 feet of horizontal clearance, 15 feet of vertical clearance along the roadside.
And for everyone, I added the list of contractors that MOFD has had experience with to the chat.
Yeah. So question about Firewise neighborhoods, encouragement to form them. We certainly support that. We had one defunct Firewise neighborhood in Sleepy Hollow 4 years ago. We're close to 30 now. We think Firewise is a great way to organize and to channel a community's interest in wildfire safety. We're certainly continue to encourage those and are active in carrying out the assessments that help them become Firewise neighborhoods. For the question about scheduling fire safety inspections, we don't do those. There are 14,000 parcels in the district, and the fire safety inspections eat up a tremendous amount of resources that are spent either that pull away from chipping or from enforcement. So made a decision about 2 years ago that we stopped doing individual site assessments, and we've now put those same resources into chipping, removing fuel, and then inspections after June 1st. We do have a significant amount of information on our website that provides videos and pictures to amplify some of the points made tonight. And we'd encourage folks to review those or request a visit from a fire adapted community ambassador, or if you're in or near a Firewise community, many of those members are conversant on the fire safety ideas as well. So good question about ground cover. We are not decanning, it's decadent. So is there dead elements of the material that's held? So if you think of, as an example, not suggesting this is a creeping green ground cover, but if you think of a blackberry bush, there's little to no portions of the blackberry bush that are dead. It's all live and vibrant. On the other hand, think of a rosemary bush where you could reach your hand in and snap off a handful of dead, dry material. So with the material or vegetation that's used as a creeping green ground cover, it should be something that maintains green and live and does not hold dead portions. If there's any dead portion, one, is probably not appropriate to use as a ground cover, and two, it would require some maintenance to clear it out. For brush and bushes that are next to the house, irrigated or not, they all require a 1 foot vertical clearance. There are significant number of species that irrigated or not will still burn. And we want to create that separation so a small creeping fire isn't able to climb up into the bush. So if you think of a home with overhanging eaves, right? So something like this where the walls and the roof meet. If fire begins to burn underneath those eaves with any force, the eave traps it and forces the heat up into the void spaces of the attic, making it very likely that the house will burn to the ground. With a question about, Linda asked a question about green ivy is allowed as a ground cover. That is correct. Green ivy is one of the acceptable creeping green ground covers that can be used within 2 feet of a structure in lieu of mulch. The question about how to become a fire adapted community ambassador. Last night we held a meeting of the current group, and we will be sending out tomorrow a solicitation for folks to sign up. to participate in the training and become enrolled in the program. Right, and as I think Dennis put here in the chat, if you have a complaint, if you have seen Dennis, you can put that to everybody, please. If you have seen a complaint, if you believe there is, or if you have seen something that you believe is unsafe and requires a complaint of a fire code violation, there's a link on our website that allows you to report the violation. It's tremendously helpful if you include a picture that allows us to understand what you saw. We've regularly gotten complaints that had the specificity of saying, I saw something that was unsafe, or I saw a dead thing with no additional details. It becomes very hard for us to figure out what you saw. If you include a picture, that's very, very helpful. Well, that seems like we're tapering off.
Yep. The one that I don't think we got to is Anne Marie asked if there'll be another virtual evacuation exercise like last July. And we are meeting in the next couple of weeks with all of the Moraga-Orinda police chiefs to start planning those. I would expect something in early June that we'll be doing for the Moraga-Orinda area again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Great question. Okay, well, respecting everybody's time, I would finish by asking, please, folks, take a hard look at your property. If you have a hill full of dead grass, if you have dead trees, if you've got heavy concentrations of vegetation right up to your house, that will absolutely support fire spread. And there's work you can do, and you can do it now. We have the gift of time. We have seen other communities suffer wildfire loss, and more by a combination of luck that the ignitions have not occurred on the wrong day at the wrong place, and the skillful response of our firefighters, we have not experienced wildfire loss. Statistically, that will not last forever. And we have the gift of time now where we can prepare ourselves, we can remove the fuel that will support fire spread, that will reduce our exposure to wildfire risk. It will reduce the likelihood that elements of our areas in our community will become uninsurable. And we have that opportunity now. And I would ask everyone to please do your part to bring your parcel into compliance. There's more, as I said, more information on our website. We're happy to provide additional information. If you have a question, give us a call. We're happy to answer it. But really, at the end of the day, we're talking about taking out vegetation and clearing the place out. Diane, you have a great question about vent screens. Thank you. One of my favorite topics. Vents should be either 1/8 or 1/16 inch mesh, or a ember resistant specific device such as a Brand Guard or Vulcan vent, which can be retrofitted. But with the 1/8 inch or 16th inch, it's low cost, it's readily available, can be put up with a staple gun, and that will go very long way to preventing embers or sparks or firebrands from getting into the void spaces. Without that, it's very unlikely. A house becomes unlikely to survive a firestorm if it doesn't have the ability to repel embers through the use of fine mesh vents. All right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I apologize that I didn't note earlier. We have Director Steve Danziger, one of our board of directors, is with us. If there are any other directors here, I thank you for joining us. Fortunately, I can't see the full list. And appreciate that almost 100 folks took some time out of their weeknight to come participate. As I said, I'd ask you to take some time out of your weekend and in your planning coming up to do the work to get your parcel ready. Once your parcel is compliant, send us some pictures, use the self-report, and then maybe go talk to your neighbors and encourage them to do the same thing. Little by little, this information will spread, people become compliant, and we can reduce our community's risk of exposure to wildfire. So thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a great night, and look forward to seeing you at the 4th of July parade or one of our open houses.
Thank you, everyone.